While Dwarf Fortress, the role model of many modern survival sims, has been playable since 2006, it's not necessarily the epitome of accessibility and graphics, with its keyboard controls and ASCII characters. So it was just a matter of time until a game came along which reduced the complexity a bit, but exchanged that for much better controls and accessibility. And well, sounds and graphics. RimWorld, which also switched the scenery to an alien planet, was released into early access in 2013 and certainly gave quite a boost to the genre. And while Dwarf Fortress is still an alpha and the Steam version is still far away from release,
so we're making progress here.
There have been quite a few contenders trying their luck in this field. There were direct clones like Gnomoria and also games which, similar to RimWorld, wanted to put their own spin on the concept and put it into a science fiction setting like Maya and Spacebase DF-9. With the latter, however, you can also see that not all attempts of riding the wave are rewarded with success. While I already gave Spacebase DF-9 a shot some years ago and pretty much confirmed the bad Steam ratings, Maya still remains for some other day. Today, however, we will have a look at Judgment, a survival sim by a studio called Suncrash, released in 2018. In this case, the game concept was put into a post-apocalyptic, demon-infested world. I recently finished the game on my German Let's Play channel, and now it's time to have a look and see how well the game is doing compared to the competition, and how it's standing out from the other games.
Survive is to prevail. Will you survive Judgment Day? Judgment.
Besides of the before mentioned demon apocalypse setting, we will notice another big difference right away. In difference to Dwarf Fortress and the commitment mode of RimWorld, there are no save and load restrictions in Judgment. Not even by some voluntary option, so that you can freely save the game whenever you are out of combat. Of course, that also means that you can easily redo situations if they didn't work out as well as you initially thought or planned, which does play an elemental role in a couple of game mechanics. But I will get back to them later on. In general, the settings we have available to customize the game are much more limited compared to games which are closer to Dwarf Fortress. One of the reasons for this is that the immediate area we get for our base has basically no relevance in terms of gameplay. This means that the difficulty is not being influenced by starting on an icy planet or something similar like in RimWorld, but it's almost exclusively set by the difficulty level we choose at the start of the game, and which we can customize to some degree. In terms of game modes, the only thing we can decide on is whether we want to play in the classic mode, in which we got a story and an ending we can reach, or in the sandbox mode, which does not have these elements. Personally, I don't see any good reason for wanting to play in the sandbox mode, as the influence of the quests or the achievable ending does not limit your options in the game by any means. Lastly, we need to put together our starting characters. While we can freely choose the name and the looks, which we can also freely adjust later on, the character's class and perks are randomized and can be re-rolled as often as we want. Personally, I'm not a fan of rolling for your characters, as it's just laborious and you will just re-roll until you get a good combination of class and perks. I would prefer a budget of points which I could just distribute here. However, I was positively surprised by the massive amount of different perks available and their influence on the character. While the class determines which skills your character can potentially improve on level ups later on, perks can offer some of these improvements right away and give massive bonuses. A character having the perk Country Person, for example, can equip nature armor right away, which would usually need to be unlocked by leveling up a skill. Furthermore, the character also receives a boost to farming of 50%, which would then be added to the gains he receives from increasing his farming skill. Some of the maybe 50 perks in the game also have negative aspects to them, and a few are even solely negative. Who would actually want to put a smoker in the team who got 10% less hit points and 15% less energy than other characters? We'll come back to the topic of character advancements later on. For now, we'll go ahead and start the actual game. We are greeted by a short intro and the first quest, which results in a kind of tutorial battle. This first fight cannot be lost and it's being fought with two invincible characters who are not part of our chosen party. The introduction into the gameplay mechanics is done by a mix of two elements. On the one side we got manual-like tutorial instructions with pictures, and on the other side we got quests with goals like build your first house, which especially help at the start of the game when setting up the base. The basics of the combat are quickly explained. Combat works in possible real time, and enemies usually patrol in groups on the map until one party member is within their perception radius, which makes them run towards our party and attack us. The game generally makes a distinction between melee and ranged combat, and you should make sure that characters with ranged weapons are not getting into melee range. Besides of obvious reasons, enemies also then receive a bonus chance to their accuracy, and our ranged fighter receives a malus to his or her accuracy with the ranged weapon. So obviously you'd want to have your melees at the front so that the enemies are focusing on them, while the ranged fighters can freely attack anyone without being hit themselves. Ideally you'd also have something in front of you, a cover or maybe just a fence, which helps to increase the enemy's way towards you, and with that provides more time to shoot at them. Our characters can also have very few abilities, which you can manually activate and use once per combat, like a special aimed shot, a buff or a heal. But that's really the exception, which is also a good thing, as controlling abilities would probably get really fiddly with 6 or 7 characters in the team. So it's mostly down to positioning, which is fiddly as well, as the game is going a very own way in this regard. The map in combat is clearly organized in quadratic tiles, which however are much bigger than your characters, which means that they have to do more than just one step to move from one tile to the next. And this also means that any order like stopping or shooting to a character, which is right in between two tiles, cannot be executed right away. The character would first need to finish his way to the next free tile in order to do something else, which makes them kinda hard to control. In addition, positioning your characters also takes some getting used to it, as there's just so much empty space around them. And if you want to move character A over to the right, where another character is standing and where there's no remaining space, you would first need to move that other character somewhere else, and as soon as this character starts moving, the field is seen as empty and you can send character A to it. This all sounds very trivial, and it actually is trivial. However, there are good reasons why such rigid systems are usually only ever used in turn-based games. And as the field sizes are extra large here, while good positioning is extremely important in the game, the whole thing does become quite fiddly, especially when you're still learning the ropes. Once the tutorial battle is finished, it's time to build our base. As mentioned before, the surrounding area is absolutely not relevant here, and there are also no features like rivers, mountains or similar on the map, which in other games are essential for defending and therefore planning your base. So you'll just start in the center with setting up a few houses, beds and crafting stations, and once you used up your starting equipment, you start gathering wood, stones and other materials to build additional structures. You also don't need to worry about the total amount of available resources. While they can run out at some point, like you can fell down all the trees, the demons are not the only occult element of the world. Our own survivors can also do rituals, and one of them is to spawn new trees, and there's something similar for the other resources as well. The options regarding what we can actually build and which resources we can gather is quite limited in the beginning and will be expanded during the game by letting our characters research. A researching character will generate research points, which are just piled up and can then be used to unlock new stuff in one of the 5 science trees. Well, 3 science trees to be more precise, and 2 occult research trees, which are also requiring different research points. While all these research trees have some kind of vague topic, the research projects in them are actually quite mixed, which is somewhat confusing. Weapons and armor, for example, are spread out in 4 of the 5 research trees, and you should also never focus too much onto one single research, as you might be surprised that once you research the new item, for example, you cannot craft it because you cannot gather the necessary resources yet, which again have to be researched in a completely different tree. All in all, I'd say that the research system is well designed, and while there are technologies which just provide a flat bonus, most of them offer options to gather new resources, build new buildings, perform new rituals, or of course craft new equipment. And while the system has its issues in readability, it's working well and is one of the driving motivators of the game. While building and upgrading the own base is surely also a motivator, I'd clearly say that due to the simplifications, it's far less interesting and fun compared to Dwarf Fortress or RimWorld. Thinking about plans on how to dig your corridors into the mountains or how to best use the geography for your defenses is just missing in this game. Regarding defenses, all you will do in Judgment is building barricades and towers. Barricades to channel your enemies to wherever you want, as they also never attack any structures, and towers, which are mostly to improve the attack range of the survivor occupying it during combat. These kinds of simplifications also apply to other aspects of base management, which kinda makes sense in this context. So you will not need to carry materials through your camp and deposit them in a depot and bring them to the crafting station where they are needed, and instead they will just be automatically added to your global inventory, which is not physically located anywhere but accessible from everywhere. The distribution of tasks is much simpler here as well in comparison to RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress. While you can assign priorities to each character on what task he or she is supposed to do, so that the character is actually doing the task he or she is proficient in, you won't have a whole timetable with sleeping schedules and whatnot. Your characters will just eat and sleep whenever they are hungry or tired. And as I just mentioned the proficiencies, it's not just that each character class has certain skills which can be increased on level up, characters also gain more experience when doing work associated with their class, which in the priority list is indicated by a small green arrow. On level up, characters then receive 1 or 2 skill points if on level 5 or 10, and can use them to increase their skills, which then either provide passive bonuses or, as mentioned in the beginning, the ability to perform special combat actions or wear special equipment. In some rare cases, there is also a choice between 2 options within the same skill, but in general the system is pretty simple, although it's providing enough valid and appealing options to stay interesting for the most part. And much more complexity would likely also have hurt the game, because even with this system it can be a bit much if you have to handle up to 35 characters. You also have the option to completely re-roll your characters with the help of an occult ritual, giving them a potentially new class and also new perks, while they will keep their level so that they will also be able to freely redistribute all their previous skill points. And here I see somewhat of a conflict with the free saving system, which, every time luck is involved, invites to save scumming. While the rituals aren't super expensive, it's just much faster if you just reload and hope for a better result. I will come back to this problem again later on, but in general I think that's suboptimal design, even though it's not as bad as in games where you have to roll on every level up as in the old The Bard's Tale games or Realms of Arcania. The character is then basically defined by class, perks and skill distribution. Unlike in RimWorld or Dwarf Fortress, characters in Judgment don't have their own thoughts, things they like or dislike, and will also not get permanent physical or mental injuries. Which also means that there will never be these crazy stories from characters going insane. The last point I'd like to mention in the context of base management is the mechanic of demon raids. Every now and then, demons will attack your camp, and you can always clearly see on a timer on the right side when this next attack is due. While it is possible to push the timer back and delay the next attack, they are relatively easy and also do not scale with previous attacks but only with time. And because they are relatively easy, especially once your base is set up, and because demons even drop items, you can argue that you actually profit from them. The important thing though, especially at the beginning of the game, is to make sure that your own group is not away on an expedition when the enemies arrive. We'll get back to the topic of expeditions in a bit. To summarize the aspect of base management, you can say that everything, including building structures, the item system and also the character management, as well as the depth of the character system, is quite a bit simplified compared to the competition. The systems are still deep enough that they work well as core of the game, but personally I was especially missing the interaction with my environment. I just like to dig holes in mountains and have more intricate planning of my defenses. That said, the way it is, it's certainly easier to get into the game. Compared to these other titles, Judgment is doing more outside of your own base. While there are also some events where a trader will show up in your camp offering goods which you cannot craft yourself or gather in your base, the goods there are super expensive. And while it's still a great option to get stuff which otherwise would be too hard to get yet, you'd usually want to send out an expedition to gather the items from other zones. That's also true for some specific items you need for most core researches. While you can buy them from a vendor, you need a lot of luck until the vendor actually offers them, and tons of money. Other good reasons to leave your base are rescue missions and of course story quests. In order to start an expedition, you first have to switch from the base map over to the world map, which is designed in a very simple way. There are different biomes, which come with accordingly different combat maps, enemies and loot in them. As example, we will start off on green farmland, where we will face the easiest of all enemies. In cities, we'll meet stronger enemies and also find our before mentioned research items, and then there are some other regions, also including some volcano areas, which are quite dangerous. Generally, I would have wished for a more interesting design of the map, with less combat maps but with more outstanding features, which you will not find at all here. Just simple streets would have already improved the map quite a bit and would have made planning your routes much more interesting. The only thing which is different to the combat zones which you can find on the world map is towns from other survivors, which you can raid, ask for a trade caravan and where you can recruit people from. All of that will decrease the reputation towards the town, but they will also periodically ask some stuff from you, like resources, or that you clean out some monster hideout for them, which then increases the reputation again. However, the towns are one more element which invites for safe scumming. When you first discover a new town, the reputation they start out with is randomized, so you could just roll with it and maybe after dozens of hours they get friendly, or you just reload a few times. And once they are friendly, you can recruit a character from there. But of course, you'd want that character to be somewhat good. So you will also reload until you get someone decent. Of course, you don't have to reload, but because the game kinda incentivizes it, it's probably something you will just do, even though the reloading is annoying in itself as well. To start an expedition, we will first form an expedition group, which we will fill up with our characters, and of course they should also get some decent equipment to fight with. Again, this is very basic. We will have up to 7 characters in the group, and each character will have 1 weapon, 1 armor and a special item like a consumable first aid kit or something which permanently increases character stats, which I found much more useful in most cases. Now we'll set a destination for the expedition and the journey will start. The destination can be changed at any time, and so we could also send our characters back to base if necessary. The standard destination of an expedition is one of the hundreds of sectors with enemies and some items to loot, which we can all see beforehand. Almost all at least. In some cases it will show a question mark for some special equipment we can find. Once we arrived at our destination, we can choose whether we want to have the combat being resolved automatically or if we want to fight manually. And of course, in order to get the maximum out of it, we will do most of the combat manually, especially at the beginning of the game, when we are not crushing any enemies without taking a scratch. Next up, we arrive on the combat map and in theory, we got the option to just collect some crates which are lying around and then leave again. However, in most cases it's more straightforward to just kill all enemies. I already explained how the combat basics are working, but now we'll get a bit more into detail. In most cases, there are about 2 or 3 groups of enemies on the map, and within these groups all enemies are connected to each other, meaning they will attack all at once if one is aggroed. Due to the somewhat auto-movement system in which characters can only attack once they are standing still on their own tile, it's advisable to always put your party in position and have the enemies come to you so that your characters can shoot right away and don't have some movement left to do. With some luck, they will also come with some distance to each other and can be killed off one by one. Of course you can aim with your characters manually, which is best done if you pause the game for a few seconds and then choose the targets, which is especially helpful for some ranged enemies. As mentioned before, against melee demons it's a big advantage to have some obstacle in your way. Every bit which makes the enemy's way to you longer might result in the advantage you need to go out of the fight without big losses. The variety of enemies in Judgment is actually quite good, and most of them have some distinctive characteristics. Rather early in the game, the first hellhounds will show up, which are super fast and do tons of damage, but they drop down dead after just a few shots. There are ghosts, which do a lot of range damage, but also have relatively few hit points compared to possessed ones, which do less damage with their pistols, but can take quite some damage. Then we got a type of enemy called a Legion. It has tons of armor and hit points, but it is super slow and uses melee attacks. And on the opposite end we got Fallen Angels, which have an extremely high range and might also ruin the plan of staying back and let the enemies come. Overall, I'd call the design of the enemies as very well done, and there's not a shortage in types of enemies either. I have only mentioned a couple of them here. In this context, I'd also like to praise the combat stats in the game, which are relatively intuitive and easy to understand. While the exact formulas cannot be found in the game, mechanics mostly work as you'd intuitively think. For example, you subtract the armor value from the damage and end up with the actual damage on the target. Similarly, it's working with accuracy, where you just subtract the dodge value from your hit chance. Just the DPS value on the weapon is a bit misleading, because it obviously can't know which values enemies have, and as they have a big impact with the evasion and armor, a weapon with a lower DPS can actually end up with substantially higher damage. There's also one value for every enemy on how much of the damage is persistent. Ghosts are a good example of an early enemy with a relatively high value, and they get quite nasty because of that. But don't worry, persistent in this case doesn't mean that you can't heal it for the rest of the game. It just means that you won't be able to heal it during the combat with skills, and it will also not heal automatically after the fight ended. In order to heal it, you would need to have it healed in your base, where it would also regenerate automatically. And because of this mechanic, you also have a limitation on how much you can do in a single expedition. At some point, your characters will just run out of maximum hit points, which especially affects your melees, which are blocking the enemies. When they are down to just a couple of hit points and they would just die by one hit, it's definitely time to take the route home. Overall, I think the combat is okay, but not exceptionally good. Due to the limited options you have, the real-time combat with pause works fine, but the positioning of your characters is definitely not feeling great. As mentioned before, the enemies are well designed and distinctive. The map design, however, can be somewhat problematic, especially on more difficult battles when you got limited options to use cover to your advantage. And while the maps are random, they are not randomly generated, but there is a limited preset of maps you can get. So after some time, you know where the good spots are, if the map has any, that is. And that's where we are back to the issue with being able to freely save and load, as you might just need to reload a couple of times to get a map where you can win a hard fight, or you just need to reduce your HP losses so that you can continue with doing additional fights thereafter. It's even more annoying because it's clearly more efficient to do expeditions and kill enemies than gathering resources in your base, which means that these combats will be super inflationary. Depending on the difficulty of the fights, you might do like 5 to 10 fights just within 1 hour and not do anything at your base during that time. As mentioned before regarding the world map, less would have been more here. Less generic combat, but more special events would have made it much more interesting. But while most of the combat isn't super exciting, you always have your next goal in front of you in the form of your base and equipment development, like a carrot on a stick, which makes inflationary combat acceptable. Probably also because the combat itself is relatively fast-paced. While I am usually preferring turn-based combat systems, this would likely have bored you to death here if everything else stayed the same. But besides of the before-mentioned zones, which are just there to plunder, your expedition can also have a few other targets, which are strictly connected to events. Which event you get is random, but when you get it is not, and that is also feeding into the save-scumming problem. I already mentioned one possible event earlier, where you have to kill some camp to increase the reputation for a town. Another event is to go rescue a survivor, which will then join your team. These battles are then working a bit differently than usual fights. In case of the rescue mission, it's a good idea to first kill all of the enemies and then open the cage to free the survivor. But this is a process which takes a bit, and while doing so, you need to defend against a couple of waves of incoming demons. Only after fighting off some of these demons, you can leave the zone together with your rescued new team member. The balance of these rescue missions is somewhat off, on the highest difficulty at least, as they scale much faster than attacks on your base, for example, which makes them almost impossible to do once you're further into the game. And then we got the quests from the main story, of course, which will send us to some locations now and then. Outside of the campaign, we also get some random story events, but they are rather rare and short, and while some involve some fighting, most of the time we just need to pay some resources to get a reward. All in all, I would have preferred to see more story content and variety here. It just becomes somewhat repetitive after a while. And with that, we are almost at the end of the review. Before we get to the conclusion, I will quickly talk about bugs, graphics and sound. Regarding bugs, there's really not much to say, which is a good thing. The game was already released 2 years ago, and if there were bugs at release, these have been fixed by now, and the game is in a pretty perfect state in that regard, and feels extremely polished, which is a bit surprising. Surprising because the graphics might give a first impression of a roughly put together indie project. Not that the somewhat weird mix of polygon models and drawn surroundings was super ugly, but it looks rough and it stands in contrast to the polish of the game. The music is quite okay and supports the game well, but it's nothing exceptional. And with that, it's time for the conclusion. I would call Judgment as simplified version of RimWorld, which again is a simplified version of Dwarf Fortress. And as Judgment comes with quite some polish, offers a good interface and also a decent tutorial, you could say that it's the easiest game for beginners to get into. However, you can't keep removing complexity forever, and Judgment already has some elements which feel a bit too thin, thinking about the construction of your base. So what does the game bring to the table to compensate for that? I guess the idea was to have a stronger focus on combat and the expeditions, but I see quite a bit of room for improvement here. On the one hand, because of the fiddly controls, and on the other, as the variety could have been better, considering you need 52, in my case far more than 100 hours to beat the game. The combat is probably also the reason why there is no Iron Man mode, and you can always save and load, which also has impact on other elements of the game, which strongly incentivize to save scum. Nevertheless, the concept still works and is fun. The base building, even though it's quite simplified, still motivates. Same goes for researching new equipment for the characters, as well for the relatively simple story of the game, where you always have some next step to reach. And that's why my rating for the game is a 3/4 thumbs up. It's a nice game with a couple of weaknesses. I'd recommend it to players which would like to see more in this genre and who already played enough of RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress, and also to players who feel that these two games are too complex and who are looking for an easier entry into the genre. And that's it for this review. I hope I was able to give you a decent overview about the game and maybe even some insight into the genre itself. If my review was of any help to you, it would be great if you could rate it or subscribe to this brand new English channel, which at this point is somewhat of an experiment, as I am usually doing videos in German on my other channels. So subscribing here would be a great help in order to see whether the channel actually makes sense. That said, the channel will be filled with English gaming content in general, which can also include previews and let's plays and not just reviews, just so you know what to expect here. I also made a highly modern webpage over at ndnw.net, which includes all the games I have ever played. While there are screenshots and my opinion on them there's in English, for now all my linked videos are in German. But maybe you'd like to visit it nevertheless, just to dig into some old memories. Be aware that you can disable the option to just show games with reviews. So farewell for now. I will go back to save scumming my way to the perfect character. Until next time. Crap. And reload.